In the spring of 1873, a man named Jay Cooke, most powerful banker in America, walked into his office thinking he was the master of the financial universe. He had single-handedly financed the Union during the Civil War, and his influence was so vast that people called him the tycoon of the world. But by September 18th of that same year, his empire didn't just stumble, it vanished into thin air. When the doors to his bank were locked at 11 o'clock that morning, a messenger boy ran into the New York Stock Exchange and shouted two words that caused the room to fall into a deathly silence. Cooke failed. Within minutes, the heart of the American economy stopped beating. Men began to scream. Stocks plummeted into a black hole of value, and the exchange was forced to shut its doors for the first time in history. This was not just a bank failure. It was the birth of a pattern that would haunt the world for the next 150 years. It was the moment the world realized that our entire financial system is built on a ghost, a promise that can be retracted at any moment, leaving the average person with nothing but a pocketful of worthless paper. The chaos of 1873 was the direct result of a period that looked remarkably like our own world today. It was an era of incredible technological leaps, where the telegraph was the new internet and the railroad was the new global supply chain. Money was flowing like water, and the appetite for risk was infinite. Investors were pouring their life savings into projects they didn't understand, driven by the fear of missing out on the next big boom. The banks, eager to satisfy this hunger, began to lend money they didn't actually have. They created a massive bubble of debt, backed by the belief that growth would never end. But beneath the surface of the Gilded Age, the foundation was rotting. The crisis began far away in Vienna, triggered by a crash in the European stock market, proving for the first time that in a globalized world, a spark in one corner of the globe can burn down a house on the other side of the ocean. As the panic crossed the Atlantic, the realization hit that the wealth people thought they possessed was an illusion. In a matter of days, the streets of New York and London were filled with people who had been wealthy on Monday and were beggars by Friday. This was the moment the world first encountered the $0 solution. It is a terrifying economic phenomenon where the only way to save the system is to let the people at the bottom lose everything. The government and the central banks of that era faced a choice that sounds eerily familiar to a modern ear. Do we save the people, or do we save the banks? They chose the banks. While thousands of businesses shuttered and unemployment soared to levels never seen before, the architects of the disaster retreated to their mansions to wait for the storm to pass. The true tragedy of the 1873 crisis was not just the immediate poverty, but the way it changed the nature of money itself. Before this crash, people believed that money was a physical thing, something tied to the earth and to labor. But as the banks collapsed, the world transitioned into an era of pure faith. We stopped trusting in gold and started trusting in the system. But this trust came with a hidden price that we are still paying today. When the system began to crack, the authorities realized that they could simply rewrite the rules of the game. They discovered that they could manage a crisis by shifting the burden of debt onto the future, a strategy that allowed them to survive the day, but ensured a much larger catastrophe for the generations to come. While the cities flourished in the decades following the crash, the banks were beginning to crack in new and invisible ways. The lessons of 1873 were not learned. They were simply ignored in favor of even more aggressive expansion. The world entered a cycle where every few decades a new forgotten crisis would emerge, each one larger than the last. We see the echoes of the 1873 panic in the Great Depression, the 2008 housing collapse, and in the volatile markets of the present day. The common thread is always the same: a period of cheap money, a frenzy of speculation, and a sudden violent realization that the underlying value has disappeared. We are currently living in the longest period of debt expansion in human history, fueled by digital printing presses and a global belief that the music will never stop playing. But as history shows us, the music always stops, and usually when the room is at its loudest. The modern financial world is now more interconnected than Jay Cooke could have ever imagined. Today, a single algorithm in a high-frequency trading firm can do more damage in a millisecond than 1,000 bank runs in the 19th century. We have moved from a world of paper promises to a world of digital blips, but the human psychology remains unchanged. We are still driven by the same greed and the same blindness that led the investors of 1873 to hand their gold over to a man who was building railroads to nowhere. We are currently standing on a mountain of debt that is so high that even a small increase in the cost of borrowing could trigger a landslide. That would make 1873 look like a minor tremor. The forgotten crisis of the 19th century predicted our future because it revealed the ultimate flaw in modern capitalism. It requires constant growth to survive, but we live on a planet with finite resources. When growth slows down, the system doesn't just stop. It cannibalizes itself. This is the $0 solution in its final form. It is the moment when the currency you hold in your hand or the numbers you see on your banking app lose their connection to reality. In 1873, people found that their banknotes were only good for lighting fires. In the future, we may find that our digital wealth is only as real as the electricity that powers the servers. The bridge between the past and the present is built on the choices made in the shadows of those old bank buildings. The decisions to prioritize the stability of the institution over the security of the individual created a precedent that has never been overturned. This is why, when a crisis hits today, the first response of every government is to protect the flow of capital, while the average worker is told to tighten their belt. We are living in the shadow of a 19th century ghost, governed by a philosophy of money that was born out of a desperate attempt to stop a panic that happened before our great-grandparents were born. As we look at the rising inflation, the staggering levels of national debt, and the fragility of global trade, we are forced to realize that we are not as modern as we think. We are merely the latest players in a very old game. The 1873 collapse was a warning shot that the world chose to forget because the truth was too painful to accept. The truth is that wealth is not something that can be created out of thin air by a bank or a government. It is a reflection of trust, and trust is the most fragile commodity in existence. When that trust is broken, the transition from everything to nothing happens in the blink of an eye. The story of Jay Cooke and the panic of 1873 serves as a mirror for our own time. It shows us that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, or how complex our financial instruments seem, we are always just one signature, one bad bet, or one moment of panic away from the edge. The $0 solution is not a mistake of the past. It is the inevitable destination of a system that values the shadow of money more than the substance of value. We have been warned for over a century, yet we continue to build our towers on the same shifting sands, hoping that this time the tide won't come in. The history of money is not a straight line of progress, but a circle of recurring lessons that we refuse to learn. Every time we think we have mastered the economy, we find ourselves back in the streets of 1873, watching the doors of the bank close and wondering where the wealth went. The future of your savings, your home, and your stability depends on understanding this cycle. Because in the world of finance, those who do not understand the history of the crash are the ones who are destined to pay for it. The pattern is clear, the warning has been issued, and the only question that remains is how much longer the illusion can be maintained before the $0 solution becomes our reality once again. Join us in the Money History Lab by subscribing for more stories behind the money.